I think this is the second time I've spoken to this group. It was a couple of years ago that I was here. And the topic is going to be about my new book that was out in October. And I brought a few extra copies here at a deeply discounted price of $20 if anyone wants to buy a copy. And it's on Hamilton. And if you're wondering why an economist would write a book on Alexander Hamilton, or Lincoln for that matter, I've written two of them on that, one of the reasons has to do with something that Murray Rothbard wrote in a very important essay of his called The Anatomy of the State. And in the essay, I'll read a few passages from it for you. His basic argument is that no matter how big and powerful or tyrannical a government, a state is, its power ultimately rests on ideas. It has to persuade the public, at least the majority of the public, that it is legitimate. Because after all, even the Soviet Union was run by really a few thousand people who ruled over millions and millions of people. So at any one moment, the millions and millions of people could have overrun the few thousand people that were really the upper echelon of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And so they had to rely on an ideology that legitimized them. And I'll read a short thing about short piece of what Rothbard had to say about this. He said, "It is precisely the function of the state's ideological minions," he's talking about intellectuals who work for the state one way or another, "and allies to explain to the public that the emperor does indeed have a fine set of clothes. In brief, the ideologist must explain that while theft by one or more persons or groups is bad and criminal, that when the state engages in such acts, it is not theft, but the legitimate and even sanctified act called taxation. The ideologist must explain that murder by one or more persons or groups is bad and must be punished, but when the state kills, it is not murder, but an exalted act known as war or, quote, repression of internal subversion, end quote. They must explain that while kidnapping or slavery is bad and must be outlawed when done by private individuals or groups, that when the state commits such acts, it is not kidnapping or slavery, but conscription, an act necessary to the public weal and even to the requirements of morality itself, and on and on. And so he goes on in great detail in talking about the importance of intellectuals, who he calls court historians, who create a set of ideas that legitimize all states, democracies, dictators, monarchs, and this has always been true for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, Rothbard quotes David Hume as saying this: "Nothing appears more surprising than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is effected, we shall find that, as force is always on the side of the governed, not the governors, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments," end quote. And that was David Hume saying that. So this is not something that popped into Murray Rothbard's head 50 years ago. This is something that's been part of political philosophy for hundreds of years, this idea that all state power ultimately rests on ideas. And so what I've been up to in the last several years in writing two books on Lincoln and one on Hamilton is taking a close look at this set of ideas that certainly deify Lincoln. And also there is, I wouldn't call it a deification, but idolizing of Hamilton by a lot of people in order to prop up the state. For example, when I started getting the idea for this book, I noticed that there seemed to be a lot of very worshipful biographies being written about Alexander Hamilton. And so I sort of smelled a rat there. And they always demonized Jefferson. And I always kind of liked Jefferson and his political philosophy anyway. And so that's sort of what made me think that there's something here that I could look into. And so when I started looking into the Hamilton worshipers, let me give you some examples of this. Probably the most famous Hamilton biographer right now is Ron Chernow, who wrote a big, gigantic biography of Hamilton. And he said this: he was, quote, the prophet of the capitalist revolution in America, end quote. And being an economist and having taken several courses in the history of economic thought in graduate school, I knew this was false. That he was the prophet of mercantilism, which is the opposite of capitalism in America. David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, calls himself a Hamiltonian, said that Hamilton single-handedly, quote, created capitalism all by himself. Forrest McDonald wrote another book on Hamilton. He says that he's solely responsible for, quote, making America the richest, most powerful, and freest nation in the history of the world. There's a political scientist named Stephen Knott, K-N-O-T-T, who wrote a book on Hamilton fairly recently, just a few years ago. And he says Hamilton is, quote, the founder of a great Republican empire, the one founder of the America that explored the outer reaches of space, welcomed millions of immigrants, led the effort to defeat fascism and communism, produced countless technological advances, and abolished slavery and Jim Crow. See, it's all Hamilton's doing. He did all that, according to Stephen F. Knott. After the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in 1994, Time magazine interviewed Newt Gingrich and asked him who his heroes were. And he said, in this order, Hamilton, Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, and Father Flanagan. But Hamilton was first, was his hero. I quote in my book George Will, who said that Americans like to quote Jefferson, but they live in Hamilton's country. And he was approving of that. And last year, when Ron Paul was running for president, George Will devoted one of his columns to smearing Ron Paul because Ron was advocating sticking to the Constitution. And George Will, as I recall, rather arrogantly sort of dismissed all this by saying, well, that was settled a long time ago, this business of adhering to the Constitution. But what is he talking about? And Will is a Hamiltonian. That was Hamilton's view, actually, of the Constitution, was that not that it should be a set of restrictions on governmental power. That was Jefferson's view. Hamilton's view was that if properly interpreted, the Constitution could be a potential rubber stamp for anything the state ever wanted to do. That's how he interpreted the Constitution, and that's how his political descendants have interpreted the Constitution. And in fact, when I was writing a few articles about this before my book came out, I had an email from a law student at New York University who thanked me for criticizing Hamilton. He said because some of his law professors at NYU, and this guy is a libertarian, he said they were sort of making him sick with all their praise of the Hamiltonian interpretation of the Constitution in his constitutional law class at NYU. And because it really is a way, Hamilton really did pave the way for interpreting the Constitution as broadly as possible. He literally invented the idea of implied powers of the Constitution, and which I'm going to talk about in a minute. The New York Historical Society held an event not too long ago, about 6 months ago, I believe it was, and published a book entitled Alexander Hamilton, the Man Who Made America. There's the one man again. He's like the Wizard of Oz behind a curtain, pushing buttons and pulling levers, making America work. As soon as my book came out, my publisher, which is a division of Random House, they wrote a great press release making the case that this book, even though it's about Hamilton, a historical figure, explains the current economic crisis. And that got me on some television shows, including MSNBC Morning Joe show. And so I went down there to the studio, and they sat me down next to Pat Buchanan. And the first thing he says to me is, Alexander Hamilton is my hero. And I'm on there to criticize Hamilton. And then he let me talk for about 10 seconds. And then he sort of blurted out, how could you criticize Hamilton? He's the architect of the U.S. economy, the architect of the U.S. economy. And I also was interviewed by PBS, the film crew, a couple of weeks ago. They're making a documentary on Hamilton, and they interviewed me down in Georgetown for about an hour or so. And when they invited me, they said, well, they wanted some contrarian views of Hamilton, And they described him also as the architect of the U.S. economy, the one guy. And so there are a lot of worshipers out there of